Well, g'day everyone, and welcome back to our continued journey through the idea of entire sanctification as found in Article 10 of our Articles of Faith. You might remember a couple of weeks ago I talked about consecration and the foundational issue of the self. If you don't remember that, it might be worth going back and having a look at that because it's pretty important to the concepts that are following. Last week I talked about understanding entire sanctification in terms of love and relationships, that it's much more that than it is a theological construct. Today I want to focus as continuing the foundation for our studies, and I will begin to put all the pieces together, but I want to look at the idea of original sin that's given expression in the second paragraph, where it says we are made free from original sin or depravity. For most of my growing up years, when I heard the idea of original sin, it was in terms of something that is within us, a thing that is within us that gives us a bent, a bias, a leaning towards sin that inescapably causes us to commit sin. It was then understood that entire sanctification was about the removal of that bent. And that kind of language has caused a fair bit of struggle to understand, and even rejection of the ideas, because it's such physical terminology and we aren't talking about physical concepts. For me, the best way to understand original sin and the idea of entire sanctification is following through the continuum of the issue of love and relationships. John Wesley said that sin, properly called, is a willful transgression of a known law of God. And the law he was at great pains to express was that which Jesus said when he was asked, what is the greatest law? He said, all the law is found in these two things. Love the Lord your God love the Lord your God, your Father, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That contains all of the law that we are called to follow. So, the law is love. Breaking the law of love is sin. When we look at the story of creation, we see in there a very clear picture of the issues at stake. You'll remember that in the beginning, after Adam and Eve were created, they were in this state of bliss where they were in this perfectly happy relationship. And we're even told that God walked with them in the cool of the evening. The whole place is surrounded with love. It is a picture of the beauty of their vulnerability and their openness and their love. It very clearly says that they were naked and weren't ashamed. That was a powerful phrase for the readers in the original context. It was a shamed society. That means that a person's place in that society, their value to that society, was reflected in the honor or shame they had. If they're an honored person, they have great value to the society. If they're a shamed person, then they have less value to the society. One of the most shaming things a person could do was to be naked in public. That was a terribly shaming thing to do and would greatly reduce their position in that society. Yet as a contradiction to that, it is said that the original couple were naked and were not ashamed. It was a profoundly confronting concept, because nakedness has to do with vulnerability. And when we're vulnerable, then we're exposed. And if we're exposed, then people are able to get at the deepest part of our being. And we all carry an awareness at our deepest sense of our being that we're inadequate, we're incomplete, we're, for many people, worthless, even abysmally rejectable. And so we try and protect that part of our being. But in the initial state, nakedness didn't mean shame. It meant openness and vulnerability, because at the core of their being, rather than feeling worthless, they felt valued and loved and complete. Until we see that moment when the serpent speaks And there's a picture there of evil coming in to tempt them. The temptation was less a temptation to do something than it was a temptation to understand inadequacy. What the serpent said to them basically is, you're incomplete. If you want to be complete, then you need to do that thing that God has said don't do. Then you'll have a knowledge of good and evil. You will be complete, and you will be like God. And the only place in their understanding that a temptation could actually work was in their sense of self. When the idea came that they were incomplete, it connected with something in them. They knew they were created. They knew they weren't originators. They knew they had been originated. And so there's something not quite complete there. And so then a longing in the self begins to rise, and it begins to say, I need to be completed. And here is this obvious area where I don't have completion, and if I take this area, then I can be completed. But in so doing, they defied the word of God, and they broke relationship with him, and sin entered the world. And every generation since that point has been born into this world without relationship with God, and therefore we sin, we commit willful acts against the idea of love because we are no longer centered in love. Entire sanctification then is talking about the transformation at that point. Our psyches are extremely damaged by being developed without that relationship. But at the core of our being, the core of who we are, it is possible for God to do a transformative, restorative work at that point, so that he might, throughout our entire lives, transform daily our psyches from a distorted, damaged sense of ourselves and the world around us to a continually more complete sense of who we are. But that's only possible adequately if at the core of our being we shift from a sense of who we are that's established in all of our life experiences to a sense of who we are in terms of God's love for us. And the whole message of the cross is a message of love walking into the world, and even the distortion of self, which ultimately, when he was crucified, that's where that came from. Not even that could limit love. The power of love caused him to rise from the dead and bring victory into the world. And the victory that God brings us is the capacity to be transformed at the core of our being, so that love is at the center. And that makes a very, very different concept about original sin and about sin itself when we see it in terms of relationship. Well, that's another important foundation, and we'll continue through the article itself from next week. Thanks for being with me again.